I'm going to ask each of them a question before we move on. Also remind the audience out in the web place that underneath the streaming there's a Q&A box, and I'll be checking for questions that you might submit. Don't hesitate to submit. All right, Matthew, just one quick question for now. How do U.S. and Global South countries, how do they view Chinese law? I mean, do they look at it the same? Guessing not, but tell us a little bit about that. Give a story.
Right. So I could tell one quick anecdote on that. So part of what I do as an anthropologist, which is the other hat I wear, is I try to put myself in situations where I can have encounters with those who are themselves encountering Chinese law. So I was fortunate to give a lecture to a judicial academy in Lahore in Pakistan in 2017, and I gave what I thought was a fairly measured, balanced presentation on Chinese law. I talked about issues of constitutionality, the 2005 Sunjurgong case, et cetera. At the end of the talk, one gentleman, a judge, stood up in the middle of the room, and this very sort of august person, and he took off his glasses, and he said to me, the version of Chinese law that you've told us here today is not the version of Chinese law that we know. And then he went on to explain that he had participated in one of these trips that the China Law Society and the National Judges College do to invite foreign judges and lawyers to China to teach them about Chinese law. So this is just one little snippet to demonstrate that these sort of activities, these networks, they actually matter. They shape people's perceptions. And one thing that U.S. stakeholders and policymakers need to do is they need to be part of that conversation at the point of contact to help provide other sources of knowledge on Chinese law. Thanks.
When you were just talking, though, that example about him going to China, I mean, over the years here at the Wilson Center, I've hosted countless groups from the National Committee of U.S.-China Relations, Vermont Law School. I've had Chinese judges and lawyers in here who'd been coming to the States to get training and to be, yep. I don't know. Hasn't happened in a while, though.
Yes,
unfortunately. All right, unfortunately, while there was COVID and all that. How about Kristen? How about you tell your succinct story?
Okay. Hi, everyone. My project is about the politics of Chinese agribusiness development and the factors that are driving China's transition from smallholder farming to industrial-scale agriculture. This transformation has been underway for a little more than 2 decades. I've paid particular attention to the emergence of so-called national dragonhead agricultural enterprises. And the main questions I've been trying to answer are, what accounts for these enterprises' ability to scale up agriculture domestically within China? And what accounts for their increasing presence overseas? Whether that be in the form of land purchases or mergers and acquisitions or just investment in global agricultural development projects. I'm still doing a lot of data collection, but I want to share my preliminary findings and offer a few broad policy recommendations. So starting with domestic drivers, I've identified at least 4 factors that are fueling the growth of Chinese agribusiness. The first are shifts in the rural economy, such as the shrinking rural labor supply in China and a related need to scale up and mechanize agriculture. The second is changes in urban consumption, and especially an expanding middle class that demands more meat products and high-value products. The third are concerns about food safety and the public's perception that industrial agriculture is safer because it's a lot easier to monitor than millions upon millions of small-scale farmers. And then the last is promises of food security or food self-sufficiency, which is often talked about in relation to food safety, but I think is nevertheless a separate concern. So food security or food self-sufficiency is just this continuous political pressure to maintain really high levels of staple grain production, especially with regards to rice, wheat, and corn. Interestingly, though, in recent years, some Chinese officials have started to talk about trade and foreign markets as playing a role in China's food security, probably because they know that total self-sufficiency is unrealistic. But they want Chinese agribusiness firms to be able to maximize their position in global agriculture and global agricultural trade so that the country is not dependent on the traditionally strong and dominant foreign multinational firms. So those are kind of the domestic drivers, and you can see I'm segueing now into global drivers of agribusiness development. So regarding global drivers, it's clear that Chinese firms are, first of all, targeting very specific commodities that they want to address because of the country's over-reliance on imports of those commodities. And those include soy. So for example, there's a lot of Chinese agribusiness investment in Brazil and Argentina and Latin American countries that produce soy. And pork, too, because demand for pork in China is very high. It's the largest demand in the world. And so Chinese agribusiness firms going out are really investing in those sectors. More generally, these companies are motivated to capture more profits from trade, exert general influence over global commodity prices, and create new markets for Chinese exports. Believe it or not, China actually produces more grains than it can consume, and so it has to deal with this issue of where are they going to export it. So whether through the Belt and Road Initiative or through non-BRI investments, and a lot of investment has nothing to do with BRI, China has emerged as a major investor in global food production, and so we have to update our understanding of what China is. I think for the longest time and still today, people think of it as a large purchaser of agricultural imports. It has the largest population in the world, it needs to feed its people, and so it's the largest buyer of goods. But it's no longer just a buyer of goods. It is also a producer, it is also an exporter, it is also its own importer. As for policy implications, I think U.S. farmers and agricultural firms here in the United States have to deal with the new reality that Chinese firms are becoming these increasingly influential global players. And similar to discourse about firms in other sectors of the economy, many people are concerned about Chinese agribusinesses. They're suspicious of them. They worry that the Chinese government is providing them with too much support, which creates unfair competition. People are worried that Chinese firms could gain control of key nodes in food supply chains. In the United States, there's concern about China controlling pork production in the United States. There's also concern about it controlling, soy and other markets overseas. And there's this idea that they're bad actors that are trying to steal advanced agricultural biotechnology. So many of you may be thinking about ag as kind of a very traditional industry, but actually it's kind of at the leading edge of some of these new technological innovations because genetic modification and biotech is a really important part of ag industry. So all of these are real concerns that nevertheless, in my view, have become overly politicized in the United States as the US-China relationship has gotten worse in recent years. So my recommendations for policymakers would be to first recognize that the forces that are fueling this transition from smallholder agriculture to industrial scale agriculture, they are pretty much at this point irreversible. And instead of focusing on how or why Chinese agribusiness is bad, we need to start thinking about how the U.S. can really help China meet its food security and food safety goals. So in any kind of diplomatic talks with China, that needs to be the priority because that's what Chinese officials are going to respond to. How can the United States help it meet its food security and food safety goals? China is the largest market for U.S. farm exports. In fact, it's the kind of one area of trade where the United States has a surplus with China. And as a country that has a very, very long and, in fact, positive history of agricultural cooperation with China, the U.S. is well positioned to try and influence Chinese agricultural policies. In fact, the first memorandum of understanding between the United States and China in the reform era under Deng Xiaoping was with regard to agriculture and science. And that history of cooperation, I think, tends to get lost in current policy discussions. So the United States should be trying to promote stable trade relations that would regularly supply U.S. products to the Chinese market, which would play into their sense of food security, which, as again, in recent years, officials have been talking about as involving trade. We should also be working with food safety inspection authorities over there in China to regulate both U.S. goods that are coming in and also Chinese goods that are bound for the United States. So that's my first kind of big recommendation. The second is that, and this is where Jennifer was saying, Chris is going to tell us to all stay calm.
Are we not calm?
I think that, this is my word of let's stay calm. Policymakers really should stop trying to drum up alarm about Chinese farmland purchases in the United States. So there's been a lot of news articles about that. If you haven't paid attention, just do a quick Google search and you'll see it's exploded at both the federal level and the state level and local community level. There was this really controversial deal in North Dakota that was nixed recently of a Chinese agribusiness who had purchased farmland there. But my research confirms that globally, most Chinese agribusinesses are not investing in land purchases. This is not a big land grab move. In fact, they're investing mostly in mergers and acquisitions, and their main targets of investment are not the United States. In part because the United States has become quite hostile towards Chinese investment over time. The danger of framing Chinese investment as a security risk automatically without serious consideration of particular deals is just that you're going to end up pushing Chinese firms into other markets where inevitably they're going to be competing with US firms, right? So I guess my question is, why not allow some firms to set up a presence in the United States, especially if they can help farmers sell more to China? Now that I don't think should be a substitute for other trade negotiations to try to reduce barriers for US farmers who are trying to sell their goods to China without being owned by a Chinese company, right? Those things need to be basically worked out in tandem. But it should be a complement to those efforts. Some of you may have heard this statistic before, but I'll just close by saying that only 3% of American farmland is owned by foreign entities, and less than 1% of that 3% is owned by China. So we're talking about them being an incredibly marginal player in terms of control over US farmland. And yet, despite that, there have been dozens of bills, at least 14 by my count, introduced at the state level, banning, quote, foreign adversaries from purchasing or leasing American farmland. And in my view, this is a very outsized response to what is in reality a pretty minuscule problem. So I think that's all I have time for. Thank you.
Thank you. Reminds me a little bit of the panic when China bought the Smithfield.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. And so Smithfield is the largest pork production and processing firm in the world. And it was purchased by a Chinese company in 2013 by Shuanghui, which is now called WH Group. It's also called Shineway in English. And I think prior to that, so it's the historically largest acquisition of an American company by a Chinese company. It's headquartered in Virginia. And there were congressional hearings about this deal. There was a lot of political buzz about it when the deal was being made in 2013, because this is a government-controlled company, and they're going to take over control of the American pork production. And I do think the concerns are legitimate, but like 10 years on, I don't think those concerns have played out. And I think what's missing in this discussion about Smithfield is that it was actually the United States government that was encouraging Chinese firms to invest in U.S. agriculture. And I believe it was Henry Paulson, the Paulson Institute, that facilitated this deal and was really looking for a way to give the U.S. pork industry a boost and increase U.S. pork exports to China, because pork consumption in the United States has been going down. Pork consumption in the United States and in China keeps going up, right? And so, yes, there are maybe some government connections, although I think some people think the meaning of private firm is kind of meaningless in China, but by many measures, WH Group is a private firm. And again, what gets lost is that it was actually the U.S. government that facilitated that merger and acquisition. It wasn't the Chinese government. And I've noticed, I was reading news articles, interviews with the current Smithfield CEO in light of he was being interviewed about these recent debates about whether or not China should be allowed to purchase U.S. farmland. And he's trying to allay everybody's concern, saying this has been really good for my company and very good for all of the farmers at Smithfield, and we are still Smithfield. Like nothing, China actually, besides owning the company, has very little influence over day-to-day production. So it was a turning point in, I'll just end by saying it was a turning point in that prior to 2013, prior to that deal, I think that U.S.-China ag cooperation was really strong. And it wasn't talked about in this kind of securitized way, that this is a security risk. But after 2013, it became this really contentious kind of security issue.
One little factoid, because I was doing a project on food safety at the time, before then, and one of the other reasons that the Chinese wanted to buy it was that, and the Smith, they told me that to learn about some of the better sanitation practices in terms of slaughtering and animal care, and so it was just like, so it had a strong food safety component to it as well. All right, thank you for that.
Thank you.
I can go on and on about pigs, but we won't.
All right.
Here you go, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Jennifer. So my project for the Wilson Center, as Jennifer said, investigates the closing space for international groups and foreign support for civil society in both China and Russia. Although this fellowship is primarily focused on China, a paired comparison with Russia provides both scholarly leverage and real-world importance, as it is in many ways China's authoritarian peer. So this project was inspired by the time that I spent in the field during work on my first book project, involving interviewing environmental activists in both countries, in both China and Russia. That coincided with a period of time where both governments were passing legislation regulating and restricting foreign organizations and the funding of civil society groups. In past work, I've examined how domestic civil society actors in both countries were affected by the laws, but in the project for Wilson, I am focusing more on how international NGOs and foundations have responded, including some of their more innovative pathways forward. So I'll describe these laws briefly as background, particularly because most of the people in this room probably aren't as familiar with the Russian case. So in 2012, Russian lawmakers passed a series of amendments to existing law governing NGOs that came to be known as the Foreign Agents Law. The regulations require domestic Russian NGOs that receive foreign funding and engage in ambiguously defined political activity to register themselves as foreign agents with the Russian Ministry of Justice or face steep penalties. In 2015, a follow-on law on undesirable, quote-unquote, foreign organizations was passed that allows Russian lawmakers to shut down any international organization that is perceived to endanger Russia's national security. As of the end of April of this year, there are 86 organizations on the undesirable list, and Wilson Center is, in fact, among them. Russia's war against Ukraine has accelerated the use of these existing anti-foreign laws, and the foreign agents and undesirables labels have been used extensively as a tool of repression in the last year. For example, on Friday, Greenpeace Russia, which has operated in Russia for more than 30 years, was listed as undesirable and forced to close. So these are laws that were passed 10 years ago that are still having a major impact, which is why I'm still looking at them today. In 2017 in China, what's commonly referred to now as the Overseas NGO Law came into effect. And that law increased requirements for foreign NGOs that legally operate in China. It requires registration under the Ministry of Public Security instead of under the Ministry of Civil Affairs, and the sponsorship of a new Political Supervisory Unit, or PSU. This is registration that allows organizations to operate in China. And to date, there are more than 600 representative offices of foreign organizations that have been legally registered in China to continue to operate. Still, there are many notable absences from that list, and many organizations have quietly abandoned their China operations because of the law. In both countries, these restrictive laws have had a chilling effect on the atmosphere for international philanthropy and transnational connections to domestic civil society. However, neither country has taken steps to completely ban all foreign organizations or their support for civil society groups. In my earlier work, I show that these laws have been used, in fact, selectively to repress some foreign-supported or foreign organizations while encouraging others. This leaves international NGOs and foundations and the groups that they support to make their own decisions about whether the benefits to continue their work in these contexts outweigh the risks. Others have been subtly or explicitly banned from operating in these countries. So my project for the fellowship examines these developments, first considering this bigger question of whether China and Russia learned from each other's experience when regulating the sector. It's a big question, it's a very hard one to investigate. And although the laws both stem from a at least stated fear of foreign-supported civil society instigating a color revolution-style movement, I honestly find little evidence to directly link the two countries' NGO regulations. But there have been several academic and think tank exchanges between the two countries, particularly in the last decade. And Chinese scholars from government-affiliated think tanks have analyzed and praised Russia's NGO laws and their management of foreign civil society. So it's important to underscore that the Russian and Chinese NGO laws are very different and have had very different effects, but Chinese policymakers were certainly aware of Russia's attempts to regulate the sector a few years earlier and were following it closely. So that kind of finding dovetails with some recent scholarship that shows how states in the post-Soviet region, the Middle East, and Africa have all learned from each other's examples in developing these types of restrictive NGO laws and other types of repressive legislation. The second part of the project focuses on how international NGOs and foundations are responding to this changed atmosphere for their activities. This includes whether groups decide to exit or stay, how the law affects their continued operations in the country. But I'm also highlighting in this project the innovative ways in which international NGOs and foundations continue their work outside of China or Russia with those types of stakeholders. So that includes pivoting to work with civil society actors overseas on mutual projects in third country contexts, supporting exiled activists abroad, and working with broader diaspora groups or students studying overseas. So I also leveraged historical sources to show how foreign foundations and NGOs have adapted their activities in response to other politically sensitive times throughout their history. So certainly during the height of the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States, there were still quite a few exchanges happening that were funded by these organizations. So to conclude, I wanted to briefly discuss some of the policy recommendations from this project. For INGOs and foundations, there's a pressing need not only to share best practices with other groups operating within these authoritarian contexts, but also to learn from other country offices within their own organization and from their organization's own history. It's possible that adaptations from the Chinese or Russian context might inform other country offices or programs throughout the organization. Within the larger international donor community, there could be a division of labor regarding the types of funding activities or niches that each of these organizations could occupy while balancing their relationships and security concerns in these contexts. Because this is a China Fellows Conference, I'll focus mostly on recommendations for China-focused work. So while even before the war against Ukraine, it was hard to convince donors or board of directors, members of foundations to stay in Russia despite the risks, many international organizations feel pressure to remain in China and to be seen as fully internationally engaged and relevant. There are also many who feel that continuing a domestic presence is essential to their mission, their original stated mission to have work in China with Chinese stakeholders. So for those groups that are still able to operate in China, there's still room to work on certain topics, and in particular to engage on philanthropic capacity of Chinese domestic organizations. For those international foundations and NGOs that can no longer operate in these contexts or are looking for ways to pivot their activities and hedge against risks, there are several other ways to remain engaged. One is working with Chinese partners in third country contexts. In work that I have done with other colleagues, Wendy Loiter and Austin Strange, we have found that many international NGOs and humanitarian organizations are in fact working with Chinese actors abroad on joint projects often related to the impact of Chinese investment abroad or global environmental issues or humanitarian aid. That's another way to continue to aid Chinese NGOs and philanthropic organizations as they go out alongside Chinese firms. Finally, international NGOs and foundations that can no longer operate in China and perhaps work on more sensitive issues like human rights or democracy promotion could pivot to working in support of activists and their former partners from authoritarian contexts who are now abroad. This includes not only helping their former partners leave the country, but also continuing to facilitate their activism from abroad. There's also a need within this community to have more training on digital security and other ways to mitigate transnational repression of activists. In addition, international NGOs and foundations, particularly those engaged in education and cultural exchange, could also increase support for programs at U.S. colleges and universities, such as those that support scholars at risk from these countries, as well as programs to reach out and engage more with students studying overseas in the United States. Finally, the funders could also engage more with broader diaspora communities, as some other former Wilson China Fellows have also advocated, which includes potentially funding alternative sources of information in the group's native language to combat isolation and disinformation within those groups. So I also have several takeaways for U.S. policymakers, but I'll save that in case they come up in the Q&A.
Okay, sounds good. All right, great question. Just because, just so Elizabeth and I, we were sisters who hadn't met until face-to-face until today, because like we should have met a heck of a lot sooner, because I do environment, you do environment. Where have you been? Hanging out too much in Russia, probably.
I guess.
So wanted to ask you some of your previous work that it's not part of this exact study, but you've also, how about the activists inside China related to this NGO law?
Right.
And maybe even compare them to the Russians.
Sure. I think it's important to understand, so some of the concern from international organizations is, well, are we putting activists at too much risk? Should we not engage at all anymore? Is having a grant from us putting activists within mainland China or Russia at a level of risk that we just shouldn't put them in? I think that for a lot of activists that are working in particularly sensitive areas, it might be the only lifeline that exists for them still. And that we need to trust activists to have their own agency and understanding of the risks that are involved and to let them make those decisions. There will be those and have been those that have stepped away quietly from accepting foreign support. But there are also those that depend on it still and are willing to take those risks.
Okay, that's good to know. And I'm going to, in the big one, I have a question that's going to straddle you two in a moment. But okay, let's go to, just above, I forgot to before. Can I be your Vanna White?
Please.
I'm going to hold this up.
Please.
I'm going to hold this up and you tell them what we have here. We have a book. He published a book just out. Ecological States, Politics of Science and Nature in Urbanizing China. Can you say one thing about the book besides
will.
buy it?
Yeah, I
Okay, you're
will.
going to say that. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah,
Okay,
I
go
will.
ahead.
Thanks so much, Jennifer, for moderating the panel, introducing the book, and a special thanks to Lucas, whose organizational labors essentially have brought us all together today. Thank you for that. In the short time that I have, I'm going to highlight some of my key research findings and relay some basic policy suggestions. So my Wilson Center project is called Ecological Civilization Goes Global. I'm asking questions about the operation of something that I'm thinking about as green soft power, particularly through global South conservation initiatives. And this project builds on my book project, Ecological States, which looks at the relationship between ecology and state power domestically. And I'm starting to think about it now in global or international contexts. So the predominant sense that I think people get from listening to news media or reading scholarly reports on China's global environmental initiatives is that China is involved in just about everything. China has developed extensive programs to support biodiversity conservation, climate adaptation, and green energy transitions, particularly within Global South contexts. By exporting Chinese finance and expertise to Asia, Africa, and Latin America, China is building networks and facilitating the practical environmental work that needs to happen. And often what you hear alongside this is that China's global green initiatives are something of a Trojan horse for central state power abroad. Indeed, this is a really important question to ask, but also a really important question to research empirically. My research counters this prevailing narrative. China's green soft power at present is quite limited. While on the rise globally, I want to suggest that it remains relatively weak. So what do I mean here by green soft power, and how have I been researching it in China's global environmental initiatives? So I've come to think about green soft power as expressions constituted in relation to environmental discourse and practice that influence actors to adopt shared values, goals, and generally positive associations to a given country. So this is something of a working definition, and we can talk about this more. So I've been researching China's green soft power through cases of multilateral and bilateral environmental exchange. My multilateral case focuses on China's role in the recent UN Biodiversity Conference called COP15, and I focus on two cases of bilateral environmental exchange in Southeast Asia. One is on marine spatial planning, and the other is on mangrove conservation. So I've only got 5 minutes, so I'm just going to talk very briefly about these cases and what I think we can garner from them. So for the first time in history, China served as president of a major UN environmental conference when they hosted the COP15 UN Biodiversity Conference. Part 1 took place in 2021 in Kunming, and Part 2 took place in Montreal in 2022. At the conference, China took a leading role in brokering what is now called the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. This is essentially a biodiversity framework that sets the targets for the next decade of biodiversity conservation globally. The conference was thematically titled Ecological Civilization, Building a Shared Future for All Life on Earth. Ecological civilization building is China's homegrown environmental discourse. It's also a vision of global environmental change and socio-natural optimization. So I've been researching how ecological civilization resonates globally through interviews with UN delegates from all over the world. Some international representatives claim that ecological civilization resonates with them and resonates with the goals of their organization. Others, however, expressed dissonance or suggested the concept was not adequately explained for an international audience. So this suggests that China's green soft power in this multilateral form is quite limited. And these limitations were echoed in cases of bilateral environmental exchange. In my cases of marine spatial planning and mangrove conservation in Southeast Asia, Chinese organizations provide really crucial support for advancing local environmental goals and local environmental projects. So these bilateral exchanges can be seen as contributing to local environmental aims, but they also reveal limitations of influence in the particular countries where they manifest. So what I really need to stress for this forum here is that China's global environmental exchanges are not monolithic, nor are they fully orchestrated by Beijing. Rather, I want to suggest that you could think of them as internally competitive. Environmental cooperation entails a process of exchange that often manifests in a project, an environmental project of some kind, and not infrequently these environmental projects can open the door for Chinese economic investment. Chinese state, private, and civil society organizations are at times in competition with one another to establish these relationships and establish projects abroad. So sometimes they're in competition, and sometimes they form alliances to work towards shared goals. Why is this important? Because it challenges this pervasive narrative that China's global environmental initiatives are essentially a Trojan horse for central state power abroad. The reality is much more complex, with a large number of organizations involved, and each of them have their own interests. So within this context, where there's many different organizations, state, private, civil society, I want to suggest that there's a lot of room for policymakers to support U.S.-China cooperation on the environment. It's imperative at this time when geopolitical tensions are very high to enhance U.S.-China collaborations and work towards shared environmental goals. Instead of viewing China's environmental initiatives as a threat, they should be seen as an opportunity for cooperation. It's hard to overstate the importance of this because, in my mind, conserving biodiversity and mitigating climate change are essential to global security and peaceful international relations within this century, within the 21st century. So I'll leave my comments here, and we can open up to a broader discussion.
Well, I want to ask you one, maybe a quick two.
Sure.
So, different from what we said before, maybe. First, so when you went to Indonesia, right, to talk to some mangrove folks, and did you find examples with this Chinese NGOs working with Indonesian NGOs to protect mangroves, or what did you find there?
Yeah, so I have a couple.
found mangroves.
I have a couple of different examples that I draw on in the report. One of them is on mangrove conservation, and this is essentially what I characterize as a civil society exchange. So it's an exchange between environmental NGOs that are based in China and environmental NGOs that are based in Indonesia, and they're essentially coming together and sharing their knowledge, sharing their expertise on community-based mangrove conservation, and setting up networks that then contribute to the larger environmental programs within Indonesia and become housed within the local NGOs. Similarly, but in contrast, I've been looking at state-state exchanges between China's Ministry of Natural Resources and Thai Ministry of Natural Resources around marine spatial planning. And part of what this case reveals is that there are different organizations within the state that are vying to provide different kinds of scientific expertise and set up essentially projects of scientific knowledge gathering and knowledge exchange. So part of what this reveals, again, is that the state is not monolithic. Rather, it has its own sets of fragmentation internally, and different actors within the state or even within civil society sometimes are coming together and working towards shared goals, and sometimes they're in competition to create environmental projects and create these relationships themselves.
Okay. We're going to open up, and I'm going to ask the next question to you since we're on this topic.
Sure.
Go up the line here. Staying in the water, I guess I would say. So, well, in China, I mean, like, let's say about mangroves and wetlands, they've made a lot of progress. They've got a national wetland protection law, the Yangtze River protection law. And we're starting to see a slow reversal of that. So that's kind of like a good news story.
Right.
And that these NGOs are going out to kind of spread, not just spread the gospel, but spread these practices that are being supported also by the government. But there's also some practices within China, like the term, I think it's under the ecological civilization umbrella, like ecological migration, which maybe is not a practice that should go overseas. Can you say anything about that?
Yeah,
just real
so-
quickly, like China's snapshot
Yeah,
on
so-
conservation is mixed.
Right. So a lot of the work that I've done is on domestic environmental politics in China, and one of the chapters on my book is called Ecological Migrations, Volumetric Aspirations. It draws on hundreds of interviews with ecological migrants, that is those who have been resettled, displaced from their home, displaced from their land, and moved into high-rise resettlement complexes as part of urban conservation zoning and ecological redlining programs. So part of what the chapter reveals is that society within China is also creatively navigating these environmental policies. So often what you hear if you read the New York Times or another kind of major publication is a kind of sad story of dispossession, and those stories are real. But at the same time, Chinese society is organizing and trying to maximize the kinds of compensation capital that they can get through processes of environmental displacement. And part of what that tells us is that any given society that's interacting with Chinese policy or local environmental policy there's going to be a push and pull, a give and take. So thinking about these kind of environmental politics, I think the lesson for thinking about China in global environmental politics is that wherever China is trying to operationalize an environmental project or move their expertise into a different domain, it's also going to have to be negotiating the domestic politics and domestic economic situation of their partner countries.
Okay, thank you. Okay, kind of a story, maybe there's a question in here for Elizabeth and Matthew. Do you two, or any of you hear about, do you know Zhang Jingjing?
Yes.
Zhang Jingjing is an environmental lawyer who I got to meet back in the day. There's a group called Center for Legal Assistance for Pollution Victims. So they would go out and help, where particularly in rural areas where there's factories, they're being polluted, and helping them get legal representation. Well, she's now living in D.C. and she's University of Maryland and has this project where she's tromping around in Latin America and Africa, and she's working with communities where Chinese companies that have gone overseas and polluted, she's helping these communities sue Chinese companies. And what confuses me, and I need you to help me with this, sometimes she's saying she's trying to get them to use Chinese law in the process. I mean, any reaction to this? And this relates to you, because this is an example of someone outside China, but.
Right. So Zhang Jingjing is an amazing person. She actually is part of my research project as well. In
No,
fact,
I
we
didn't know
wrote we wrote a piece together comparing regulation, the environmental impact of investment into China versus the regulation environmental impact of investment going out of China. Right. So looking at these two different regimes and what the comparison shows is that the regulation of inbound inflows is much tighter, right, than the regulation in terms of environmental impact of Chinese ODI. And so that is just one example where we see this sort of disparate treatment, and yet there's a lot of talk, right, about ESG in China and the companies taking this on. But when you actually look at what those sources are, those norms, it's all soft law. It's non-binding, right? So that's also part of the puzzle. Right. So in terms of the use of Chinese law, this is an interesting issue that's come up a couple of times in the project, and I think what Jingjing is talking about is the Supreme People's Court issued, I think, a judicial interpretation a couple of years ago, basically saying that they wanted to obtain jurisdiction over these types of environmental-related disputes outside of China, right? So the idea is basically that the courts would kind of clean up the mess, essentially. Okay. Which sounded amazing and very progressive, but to my knowledge, it hasn't really worked out. There aren't too many cases that demonstrate that courts actually are able to do this, or that there's any enforcement. I think enforcement may ultimately be part of the issue. But what's also interesting in terms of this idea that Chinese law can be helpful in resolving these problems is from the perspective of those impacted communities in the host states. And we've heard this a number of times, for example, that the idea that the China International Commercial Court is going to solve all these problems, right? So this was an institution set up circa 2016 that was designed to at least nominally take on disputes related to Chinese outbound investment, cross-border business over a certain threshold of the monetary amount. But again, the caseload is very small. And so far, all the cases are basically allocated from the Supreme People's Court. The China International Commercial Court is technically it's a fating, it's a tribunal underneath the Supreme People's Court, right? So it's not an independent or external court by itself. And I think the reason for this small progress to date, COVID is part of the story, but also parties, non-Chinese parties, many of them have a certain sort of ambivalent attitude towards using these courts. And yet, like I said, we have talked to people, NGOs in Zimbabwe and elsewhere that are actually saying, well, what about these courts, right? So it's just interesting that there's these different conversations happening, and that Chinese courts and Chinese law is perceived to be potentially a solution to some of the problem.
And I don't know if Elizabeth, maybe if you want to give us, are there some other good examples like Jingjing that you've seen being supported overseas, doing cool stuff?
Right. I think this is actually a really good example of the fact that there may actually be more space then to go to a third country and to address China's overseas investment, right? And it's a place where international organizations can be very useful, particularly if they're adhering to a different set of standards. Often the host country's own laws, regulations, and environmental standards are weak. But if, let's say, a Chinese partner, even a Chinese SOE, there's a case of Mercy Corps operating in the Democratic Republic of Congo with 2 Chinese state-owned enterprises, but the money came from DFID, which has its own set of much more stringent regulations associated with how the project, these are 2 infrastructure projects for water, how the project went forward. And so it took some brokering from Mercy Corps with the Chinese SOEs to talk about, how to align with those sort of more stringent standards. And so I think having someone as an intermediary, whether that's someone from Chinese civil society or a place for an international organization, that could be one way to address local communities' concerns with Chinese overseas investment projects.
And because there is a push within China, to green the BRI, so maybe that's also these companies are maybe just a little bit more open because they might be sued otherwise, right? Kristen, kind of related to this question, what about in your looking the agribusinesses going overseas? Are there questions of like their environmental impacts? Are they towing the line? Like, are they bringing maybe the better standards they have in China, or is it the same as like industrial kind of infrastructure investment? Or do we know?
Yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that. It's not a question I pay close attention to, but I will say that one motivation for going overseas is the perception that overseas farming is cleaner and safer. And so if you invest overseas, if you buy a foreign company or you set up an office in the United States or somewhere else, then there's a boost to your brand, right? And there's a perception back within China that this company is cleaner and safer than other companies that don't have an overseas presence. So that's not exactly an answer to your question, but your question reminded me of that, right? I think one of the motivations for going abroad is to kind of capitalize on, right, the reputation that agriculture has in the United States, for example, which is perceived as much safer, much more modern than it is in China. And so if there are Chinese firms operating here, then they can get some kind of reputational benefit from that.
And I'm going to open up to questions so you guys think, but I have to inject something real quick. I have a project I started last September that we've branded it now as Cool Agriculture. It's about U.S.-China climate leadership on food and agriculture. And it's kind of exciting because it was actually in the Glasgow Agreement, climate agreement, they mention agriculture. And it's an area which, I've been doing this job for 23 years, and I realized a few years ago, we're not cooperating on climate ag. So just thought, so I was super excited you're doing your project. All right, some questions out here for my lovely panel. Okay, we'll do this row. You ask a question, then pass it down, and she asks the question. So we'll do 2 for 1.
Tyler Harlan again from Loyola Marymount. Jesse, building on a comment you made about ecological civilization potentially being a Trojan horse for state power, it also seems to me that that it's often the kind of going global of Chinese norms is seen as being somehow kind of worse than existing norms or Western norms. So I wanted to ask the panelists, maybe this is a little on the nose, is this true? Is it just different norms? Are the norms actually not different at all? Or maybe do we just not know what they are yet?
Okay, pass it down. Hold on to that question, then we'll take the second one.
Fred, I've got a whole bunch of questions.
Oh, okay. Can you just ask one for now? And then just ask one, and then we'll come back to you.
Okay.
'Cause it's too many if we have too many at once.
Okay, I had questions for all 4 panelists. All right, Susan Lawrence from the Congressional Research Service. I wanted to say congratulations to all of you for imparting a huge amount of information incredibly effectively in 5 minutes. Exactly what policymakers want. They want you to stand in the elevator with them and give them the pitch, and they get off the elevator and they know everything they need to know, and you guys all did that. So congrats. Oh, golly, okay.
Okay, well, no, since it's one for each, but they're quick, right?
Okay, okay, so.
She's a Congressional Research Service. Why would I not let her ask her questions? Go ahead.
So Matthew, quick question. You said China's giving advice on constitutional reform. What kind of advice are they giving on constitutional reform? How are they rewriting constitutions? Kristen, you said one of your recommendations was cooperate, get more U.S.-China cooperation with Chinese food regulators. My understanding is the FDA has been quite active in China already, so I'm wondering what more you'd want them to be doing. Elizabeth, you were making the point about how China's not necessarily learning from Russia, but I'm curious, there seem also to be these resonances between things that India is doing and what Russia and China have done. So what are the links there across those? And also, can you tell us your advice for policymakers that you ran out of time to tell us, but what would you want policymakers to do? And finally, Jesse, fascinating. Quick question, you talked about ecological migration. I remember meeting Three Gorges folks, Hubei, environmental people, who were talking, actually Water Bureau people, talking about voluntary and involuntary migrations. And I'm wondering if you have numbers for those involuntary migrations on any kind of a national scale, because I found those numbers just for the Three Gorges to be eye-popping. Thank you.
Well, those are 4 snappy questions. All right. Answer Tyler's. We'll start with you, or whichever.
Okay.
You can do both. Tyler's
So,
Congressional Research
quickly, on the first question. So, yeah, we spent a lot of time thinking with this comparison, right? Is China worse, right, than previous capital exporters? And, there is a literature on this. C.K. Lee wrote the famous book, Spectre of Global China, which I think really sort of addresses this point. I would say there's 3 things that distinguish China and sort of what the concerns that may be there. The first is, the law in many areas just is not as developed, right? So it's, I mentioned that issue of the regulation of environmental impact of Chinese ODI, right? So that's one. Number 2, the experience of the firms in dealing with challenging regulatory environments is not quite there, but that will come over time. And one thing we do in the project is sort of track what we call the learning curve, is Chinese companies are learning to navigate very challenging judicial and bureaucratic systems. But then third, I think the big one is the role of the party state in all of this, right? So obviously SOEs, that link is very evident, but then the question is with the private companies, right? What is the role of the party state? So I think those are 3 kind of issues to think about. In terms of quickly the question on constitutional reform, so it was Cambodia that adapted language from provision in the Chinese constitution, which is specifically on acts committed by citizens against the state. And based upon research, my understanding is that those are the 2 constitutions in the world now that have that particular provision.
Okay. Not cheerful, but we'll move on. Okay, Kristen?
Really quick, thank you for the question, Susan. I agree that the U.S. government and especially USDA is active in China working with food safety regulators. That's an ongoing long-term relationship. So the main 2 things that they are doing, as far as I understand it, are inspecting goods that are bound to be exported to the United States and also visiting farms that are certified organic to make sure that they are indeed organic foods. So they are active but understaffed, so that's the issue. Something like less than 10 people who work for, the Foreign Agricultural Service in China are dealing with these type of issues. And so given the volume of trade in agriculture, it's just not enough people.
And did you have anything for Tyler's question? About the going?
No,
No, okay.
I'm not sure what to say in
Okay, go
response to
ahead.
that.
Okay. Susan, thank you for the question. I think even if there's no direct, language that was borrowed from the 2 laws, certainly Chinese policymakers were aware of what Russia was doing. It's just hard to find the exact evidence. So their motivations are certainly similar in passing these types of laws, but I think it's important that to understand that the methods differ, and that Russia took a much more confrontational approach in having this very clear blacklist, right? Foreign agents, undesirables, whereas China's was the opposite. It was to decide who gets to come in and stay and continue to work. And so it's a public whitelist, essentially, of organizations that are able to continue operating. Those that, have the green light to continue. And I think that understanding the difference between them is something that U.S. policymakers should pay more attention to. Certainly, we need to be aware of the connections between China and Russia and monitor their relationship with one another, but also understand the differences between the 2 regimes and their openness to international engagement. There are many windows of opportunity, I think, for continued engagement with Chinese civil society, and U.S. policymakers could still seek ways to support and facilitate that. Other Wilson China Fellows have argued in the last couple of years that this could form the basis for track 2 diplomacy to improve US-China relations. Certainly Russia's war against Ukraine has made these types of pathways difficult, if not impossible, but that could also perhaps become a key way to normalize relations once the war ends in the future. But right now, that there's this opening, I think, to work with China. At the same time, I think US policymakers should become more engaged in combating transnational repression of exiled activists from authoritarian regimes like China and Russia, and think about humanitarian visa and asylum policies for activists at risks and ways to strengthen those.
Just
3 quick points on the first question about norms. So if we take domestic environmental politics as a norm, we would be thinking about the primacy of technical science. Environmental scientists have a really large role in shaping what happens on the ground. So that's somewhat different than what we see in the United States, where there's more participation, of movement back and forth, social surveys and whatnot to try to project and think about what will be happening on the ground if we implement a conservation zone within this area or with that area. So technical optimization is really huge. A difference in terms of participation. Then the third point, China's conservation regime is very large in scale. So when I started my research for this book in 2014, the scale of land conservation was 20% of national territory. Just last month, it was announced that they're going to boost this up to 30% of national territory, again, to align with the new 30% post-2020 global biodiversity framework. So that's all happening very fast. But in a global sense, how China operates within these multilateral platforms is very responsive and very dynamic. So they were credited with coming up with a very inclusive framework for the post-2020 global biodiversity framework that included indigenous local population, language about this within the targets, and they were really lauded for that in a lot of ways. So again, we got to think about this dynamic between, okay, are we thinking about a domestic norm going global, or are we thinking about China operating in an international sense and how those things might be different? So that's the answer for the first question. Second question, I think it's really important actually to problematize voluntary and involuntary resettlement. I want to suggest it's a false binary. While there is a formal register for that, and the National Bureau for Resettlement is looking at this and keeping numbers. One of the things that I write about in my book is actually the role of infrastructure in hastening people to accept voluntary resettlement. So if your village or if your land has electricity cut off, if it has water cut off, it feels different to live there. If half of your village has been demolished, the aesthetics of your everyday life look very different. So while it may be categorized as voluntary or involuntary, what actually happens in practices on the ground, I think trouble that distinction.
Just remind me, this was actually in Hangzhou itself, but do people come at nighttime and they paint chai, like rip down in the middle of the night?
Yes, yeah, yep.
There were these small houses in Hangzhou, and then they got ripped down within a week, and then they put up this nice big hotel. Not in a week, but yeah, but they were ripped down within a week, and I was thinking like, wonder how long that went on. So anyway, we've hit the bewitching hour, right, Lucas? Because everyone knows who's in charge of today. It's Lucas. I'm sorry we didn't have time to do more questions, but actually, I am at some point going to invite all of you back live or on webinars to dive deeper, because you all have fascinating topics. And please, let's thank our speakers today.
Thank you.
Thank you.